So, if you remember, I made a video called The Importance of the Yu-Gi-Oh! Anti-Meta a while back, and while I made most of the points that I wanted to make in that video, there were a few things left unsaid. So, rather than make an unnecessarily long video, I'm back with part 2. So, in this video, I'm going to talk about the other anti-meta strategies that were present rather than the anti-meta decks that were so popular back in the day. And one of the things that I wanted to talk about are specific cards that help negate monster effects. But to keep things focused, let's talk about a very influential monster negation card. So let's focus on a card called Skill Drain. So Skill Drain has been such an effective anti-meta card that it's found itself on the ban list for a while now. So much so that it's limited to one copy. And it's been such a menace in the meta since it's had so many different erratas and changes to its card text in order to keep it from derailing the meta's strategy. So, if you didn't know, Skill Drain basically negates monster effects. But to be more specific, the biggest change to its card text is when Konami made a ruling stipulating that monsters on the field can still activate their effects. But while monsters could still activate their effects by this ruling, it meant that things like continuous effects and protection effects were still effectively negated. And while this current errata still has some notable use today, it's nowhere near as useful as it once was. And part of the reason why was that this errata was such a downgrade, because before the change, Skill Drain was able to negate monster effects regardless of whether they were activated or whether they were continuous. And this was a huge deal since modern day Yu-Gi-Oh! Depends on instant monster effect activations so that they can get their strategies going, and it's an instant activation that they need for their strategy. And the kicker is that most of these activations are typically monster effects, which means that Skill Drain's original errata would have completely stopped the opponent's monster effects from the get-go. And it means that your opponent is pretty much stuck until they remove Skill Drain from the field. And although meta decks can still use Skill Drain, I consider Skill Drain an anti-meta card since it benefits anti-meta decks far more greatly than meta decks. And this is primarily due to the fact that anti-meta decks like Yugioh Control can use something like Skill Drain to stifle the opponent's monster's effects, while they pick apart their opponent's board with their traps. So in other words, meta decks naturally rely on their monster effects, and would put them in a greater disadvantage if decks like Yugioh Control could rely on things like Skill Drain. So it means that the meta deck is going to have to play catch up in order to get around things like Skill Drain, and anti-meta decks are basically playing to their strength when they have a card like Skill Drain. But while Skill Drain has been neutered, a similar card known as Soul Drain is still an effective weapon against the meta. Soul Drain prevents monster effect activations while monsters are in the graveyard or while they're banished, and this greatly hinders the opponent's strategy more than Skill Drain does, since modern day Yu-Gi-Oh! Involves using the graveyard to advance your strategy, and to a very high degree. And you could even consider the graveyard to be like a second deck, since most players look to activate their monster effects from the graveyard in order to search or summon something. And think about how devastating this is. Think about how many modern day Yu-Gi-Oh! Decks use graveyard effects, and think about how many effects they wouldn't be able to use because of something like Soul Drain. But if we can look at more recent and similar cards like Dark Ruler No More, they can pretty much shut off the multi-negate boards that your opponent's used to using by not allowing them to respond to Dark Ruler No More's effect. Given, your opponent can still use negation effects, but it means that your opponent can't use monster negation effects, which means things like Apollousa are pretty much out of the picture. So it's still a very incredibly powerful way for you to shut down your opponent's multi-negate board, and it provides a way for you to turn things around and fight back. But now we move on to our final card in this entry, and similar to Dark Ruler No More, Niburu is another recent anti-meta support card, and although it's also a very powerful meta card, Niburu helps reduce the overall spam game in general, and I consider it anti-meta because of this fact. And despite being a powerful anti-meta card, I think Konami missed a huge opportunity to make it even stronger. So, if you're unaware, Niburu tributes monsters via its effect, which is different from how Kaijus tribute monsters. Cards like Kaijus tribute monsters because of their summon requirement, which allows it to avoid being negated. It's a huge stark contrast from Niburu, which can be negated. However, Nibiru's strong suit is that it's a quick effect, but I think it could have been made better if Konami made it so that monster effects couldn't negate Nibiru's effect. And this would have been a real kick in the gut to the meta scene, since it would mean that they couldn't go for a 2-card monster negate strategy and just outright negate Niburu. And I think it would have brought more of a balance to the meta scene, since meta players can't just work around it by quickly getting out a monster with a negation effect. And heck, I think they should have put a stipulation that says monsters who were tributed by Nibiru's effect can't use their abilities. And I think this would have given Niburu a stronger edge at controlling the meta, and thereby making the game feel less broken and spammy. So yeah, this has been my follow-up video on the importance of the anti-meta in Yu-Gi-Oh! And like I said before, I really wanted to make this video since I wanted to talk about a different aspect of the anti-meta strategy in Yu-Gi-Oh! Especially since I mainly talked about anti-meta strategies that would prevent spamming in my previous video. And because of it, I wanted to focus on more anti-meta cards that negated monster effects for this video, especially since modern day Yu-Gi-Oh! Heavily relies on monster effects to carry out the majority of their strategies. But with that pretty much wraps it up for this video. If you would like to support more content like this, you can do so via donation on my Cash App. I need to resolve some issues with my Patreon, but I still post on there, and you can still catch my content on that same page. But for the meantime, you can help me out on Cash App by finding me at the Necromancer1040 Cash App tag. And with that, thank you so much for watching, thank you so much for your support, and I'll catch you in the next video. Alright, take care.